Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And joining us this week from Easton, Maryland, Carla Robbins, who is adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly, among other things, for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. Carla, great to see you. And from Washington, D.C., in fact, from her office, Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post, senior associate editor and national security correspondent at the Washington Post. Karen, great to have you. And Ryan Heath, I believe from New York, where he writes for Politico, the global translation newsletter. Thank you all for joining us. It's been quite a week. Ryan, let's start with you. COVID has made it known that it's back. In fact, it probably never disappeared, even though some of us thought it did. 200 million people around the world infected this week. And that was one stunning number. The other one was it took 100 million, it took a year for 100 million people to be infected and just 6 months for the next 100 million. Where are we when we look globally at the state of COVID and the new variants and the debate about vaccinations?
Yeah, to your point, Ivo, I think COVID comes in and out of our consciousness in any given national setting, but it never really goes away. And that explains a bit of the feeling of whiplash. Right now, if you're in Europe, if you're in small island states, or you're in North America, more than 50% of the population is vaccinated. If you're in Asia, it's an extremely mixed picture, running from the same sort of numbers in China down to 2% in Vietnam. And if you're in Africa, it's about 3% who are vaccinated. I would have to say that it's pretty much rolling out as predicted 18 months ago in terms of the exponential nature of the infection numbers, if not the deaths, and the way that we see vaccine inequity. We didn't really know exactly how quickly the vaccines would arrive, but it was pretty obvious they would roll out unequally, and that's exactly what's happening. The US administration is picking up the pace in what it's doing, but in my opinion is not really telling the full story there. They do donate more doses than any other country right now, but the US does not allow exports of vaccines. And that is a race that the European Union is doing a lot better in. The UK is doing well in. And even though China and Russia aren't living up to their promises, they are also exporting vaccines, unlike the US. I think in terms of who's feeling it the most right now, it's a really mixed picture. Indonesia, out of ICU beds. Some US states are getting down to single-digit ICU beds that are available. So there's no really obvious pattern. In the UK, they went for full laissez-faire, and their numbers are down. So they can't really tell you why the numbers are down because the government messaging has been mixed, and the best we can understand is it's because they're pretty much at herd immunity and it's summer. But I think that just underscores there's a lot we still do not know about this virus, the new variants that emerge from it. And my personal bugbear right now is Australia not only has very extreme systems for getting into the country and prevents its citizens, its residents from leaving. Now, if I, as an Australian abroad, were to go home to Australia, the government would now require me to ask for permission to leave to go back to the country I live in, which, basically changes the nature of citizenship and makes the country an open-air prison to a large extent. So I am feeling pretty frustrated with COVID this week.
Well, it's a frustration. I think, Ryan, in some ways we all share in one form or another. Carla, we knew that if this disease continues to spread, mutations would happen, new variants would emerge. The Delta variant, let's remember, came from India. It just shows that this is an integrated world, and you can't fight this within nations. You got to fight it across nations, and yet it doesn't seem to have sunk in some ways, even 18 months later. In the U.S. debate, in the advanced industrial debate, where it's all about me first, and now it's about boosters. And the reality is, these vaccines may well be defeated if we don't get everybody vaccinated.
I think the incredibly shameful thing about this, and it's frightening for the virus, and it's frightening for all the sort of transcendent existential, it's frightening for climate change. I mean, we can't solve problems like this unless we accept that they're global problems, and we may live in a world of borders, but they don't live. The virus doesn't live in a world of borders. As Ryan said, give Biden credit for donating. But the politics of this in the United States is precisely that we can't export it. And the politics inside the United States in terms of sheer crazy tunes right now is what's Biden's biggest political headache. It's not the question of exporting it. His biggest political problem is that 1/3 of the new cases come from 2 states in the United States, from Texas and from Florida, where these people, I mean, they're seeing the numbers go up. They're seeing their hospital attention going to get overwhelmed. And we've got 2 governors who are saying, you're not going to make mandates. You're not going to make our kids, distance from each other. This stuff is absolutely crazy. And what I've been really focused on is the US military. I mean, this is a readiness issue. This is a really big thing. So I've been writing about Austin's attempt, the Secretary of Defense attempt to deal with extremism in the US military. When you think about the fundamental mistrust of the government that is driving the anti-vaccine impulses here, and the notion that you have so many people in the US military who are saying, I don't trust the government to vaccinate me, and they are tippy-toeing around the question about whether or not they're going to mandate it, and I think they are going to mandate it, but that they have to worry about the mistrust in the military to vaccinate people, we have pretty profound political problems here. So yes, this is multi-layered, and yes, it's rich people's problems, but they're pretty profound problems here.
Erin, you know Latin America extremely well. It's another part of the world where the disease has really devastated so many of the countries there and so many of the difficulties. What are you hearing folks saying on the outside about what the United States responsibility is to help them in terms of vaccination? And bringing the vaccines to the world when we're, some of them are being stockpiled here and are expiring because nobody wants to take them at the same time that other people in the world want this stuff. It's
no, the Latin Americans have, a lot of them, Chile, other countries have gotten Brazil, Chinese vaccines that they're all worried about now. But again, the vaccination rate is low, the infection rate is high, and I think they're very concerned. But a lot of countries are disturbed at the way the United States is handling this. I just got back I went with Secretary Blinken on a long swing around Europe, and pretty much everybody raised the question of why can't we go to the United States? The EU has eliminated restrictions on most Americans going there, where vaccination rates are higher than they are here in most cases, and yet we simply don't allow them to come here. Canada, where you've got a 70% vaccination rate, has opened its border to its land border to U.S. citizens to cross. We just renewed our prohibition against Canadians coming here, let alone Latin Americans. I mean, I think that people are, there's a lot of rhetoric from the administration about we get that this is a global problem and not a U.S. problem, although obviously the United States has some pretty unique problems in terms of getting people vaccinated. But in terms of acting like a global citizen, I think there's a lot of resentment that the United States is not doing that.
I think Ryan.
Ryan, a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Ivo, so Ryan, since you've been following this around the world, are this anti-vax sentiment, which is really intrinsically an anti-government sentiment, are we the only ones who have that?
No, it's extremely strong in France, for example. And the only thing that's really worked to counter that is to bring in sort of genuine threats or missed opportunities if you don't have the vaccine, i.e. you will not be able to go into your workplace, you will not be able to go to a concert, to the cinema, etc. And the second that Macron did that, the vaccination numbers went up. I doubt that the effect would be as strong in the US, but I think we're at the point of needing to do that. And I think that's probably where companies need to step in. And that was one of the issues I was looking at this week, which companies are now mandating via a stick approach or putting in some pretty decent carrots for you to get vaccinated. And until companies step up and do that, I'm not really going to take very seriously their wider promises about an interest in social justice, fair worlds, etc. Because the thing that is blocking us from getting to that more than anything else at the moment is this pandemic. And it's obviously very hard for Biden to step in and put in sort of the extreme mandate requirements, but the companies can do it. You know, my company, Politico, we've just said we're not opening up at the moment, and we're going to require the vaccine to come back in. You know, thousands of companies that are bigger than Politico can do that as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think actually there's some other places that the government could mandate. So no, government is starting to move to a semi-mandate with its own employees, but it could argue that anybody getting on an airplane needs to be vaccinated. That would be a good thing for two reasons. One, it would make flying perhaps a little safer, but the other thing it would do is it would prevent the spread of the unvaccinated to new places. I mean, I live in Chicago. We had 380,000 people dancing in Lollapalooza at in the middle of town. Most of them did not come from Chicago, and yet they're all going back across the country. It really is
one extra point there.
Remarkable.
Good news, Ivo, I think, is the Olympics. I think they have been managed quite well. You know, and it's easy to refer to the headlines where there have been about 200 cases linked to the Olympics. But given the extreme complicated logistical nature of bringing those 200 countries and their delegations together, the COVID problems in Japan right now are mostly related to the local population, not the Olympics. So there is a demonstration now of a way that you can do a very big global event and not cause mayhem. I mean, the real test is in 4 weeks when we check that it hasn't been super spread back to the home countries. But I think that's reasonably good news. But also, people aren't going to accept lockdowns, I don't think, either because they don't believe in COVID or because they think, you know, this is a problem for unvaccinated people. I did my bit and I got vaccinated. I'm not locking down again. So vaccines are really the only option left to get rid of this.
I think too, there's certainly in terms of the government's ability to mandate vaccinations for employees and for the military is tied to some degree to the full authorization of vaccines by the FDA. They're still operating on emergency authorizations, and I think the government feels like once they get these full authorizations, which could be within the next month or so, that they'll be more in a position to go ahead and say, okay, just like with schools and polio and measles and everything else that you have to get your kids vaccinated against, that there'll be a better argument and perhaps a better legal argument for doing it.
It's true. I mean, with anthrax in the military, I mean, when they ordered them to take the anthrax shot in the 90s, which was also on emergency use, they went to court and they tied them up, which is one of the reasons they've been so hesitant. At the same time, you had 1,000 people on an aircraft carrier who got sick. I mean, if you want to talk about a readiness issue or the ability to really just tie the military up in knots, national security, I think Austin is not going to wait for that. I think he's just going to mandate it. I think his patience has run out.
Mm.
I want to hit one other piece that both Karen and Carla talked about, which is sort of this disconnect between these global phenomena that are truly global. Viruses don't have passports, weather doesn't know borders, and what it really says about the state of the global and international order, which is for 400 years has been run on the basis of states and nations, and now you have these extraordinary problems that are really hitting people. In people's lives, people's health, people's lives. People are dying in a whole variety of ways. If you go to California or Oregon and the fires, Germany and China and the flooding, that's just climate change. What does this say about the state of the international order to you? Are we just fated to fail in our global cooperation on these areas when, you know, in things like economics, we are doing pretty well and prosperity overall? How should we think about this? Carla?
Well, Ivo, you know me. I mean, I'm the one who used to get tears in her eyes whenever I go to NATO headquarters. So, I'm the internationalist. I mean, I know it's internationalism with weapons, but nevertheless, I mean, I still believe that. But then I was an editorial writer. I believe in the perfectibility of man. I think that this is a race against, because with climate change, whether it'll happen soon enough, but I still believe that, the EU, the people still believe in the project of Europe, certainly not in Hungary. I'm not going to count us out. I still have hope, but Europe better than I do.
Well, it's not just Europe, it's everybody else, right, who have to come together to deal with these issues.
No, I think that you look at, certainly in this country, pretty much everybody has domestic political problems, and those problems are intricately tied, and the divisions in those countries are tied to global citizenship in many cases, whether that's immigration, whether it's climate, and for Biden at least, I mean, you have to be very careful in how you balance these things if you want to progress on a domestic agenda. And he has said from the very start, we cannot be a global leader if we can't even get our own country figured out. And I think that's true for a lot of places. Now, maybe it's as, it's overly optimistic to say, gosh, if we could only get all these domestic things figured out, then we would all, turn our attention to the rest of the world. I don't know, but it certainly is a sort of, if you look at this country, if you look at France, especially if you look at Britain, you've got a lot of domestic political strife where you can draw direct lines to some of these global issues that are so hard to tackle.
I think it's a point well taken. Ryan, you write the Global Translation newsletter. So translate it for us, the global, where you think we are and how we might be able to deal with these global issues.
I think some of this is that we're simply more able to see the problems today. I would maybe take a tangent on that and also say that most people's lives aren't spent thinking about the global connections between different issues. And so it has to be a fairly existential threat to really engage people and make them see that that is more important than, their next family barbecue or national political strife, whatever their focus is. It might have been nuclear in the past, and it will probably be climate change next, and it's COVID today. But it's got to be something at that level to really get mass audiences engaged. At the same time, I think that we just hit in so many directions about information on problems. Famines have been going on for how many centuries and millennia now? We just didn't see the starving people until we were able to see them on television or process those images of conflict on the internet. So I think it feels worse than it is a lot of the time. And I was interviewing Achim Steiner, who's the #3 official at the United Nations a couple of weeks ago. And he just said, look, out of necessity, the UN is going to have to become a more relevant body. It's not because we're necessarily doing a great job at different problems or because people want to give authority to the UN, but it will just by necessity become a more relevant factor in national and domestic politics. And I don't know what the timeline is for that, but I think roughly speaking, that is true. And I think on something like climate, we're doing it too slow, but we are basically pointing in the right direction now. And that, I wouldn't call it an achievement, but it is progress.
And if you look at the if you look at the response to, George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter protests in Europe, the sense of solidarity, you talk to people who were, right, I don't know if you have kids, but, Ivo has kids, Karen has kids, I have a daughter. I mean, our kids certainly care about the world. And so I'm still going to be hopeful.
We're gonna keep it there. At the UN, by the way, I think through the IPCC has done an incredible job on bringing climate issues to the forefront in that way. I like the optimism that we have here this Friday, so I'm going to keep it there.
So rare.
And leave the pessimism for a future round. Carla, don't know whether you want to be optimistic about that, but Iran has a new president. Ayatollah Raisi, who has taken over yesterday, was inaugurated. He is not known as a moderate or a soft liner, and it just seems that the relationship between the United States and Iran is not likely to be improving anytime soon. And yet Iran will still be a major player in the Middle East and in our consciousness. How do you read the situation today? And in particular, the Biden administration came back, wanted to have this nuclear deal restarted. Where do you think that is right now?
Not going to be optimistic on this one, Ivo, sadly. So Raisi, a new hardline president, he's under US sanctions for his role in this death commission in the late 80s, part of a group that ordered the extrajudicial execution of 5,000 members of an opposition group, including children. He won with the lowest turnout in decades, 48.8% officially. So who knows what the real numbers versus just 70% just 4 years ago. He's facing an Iranian population that's water and electricity shortages, the highest COVID fatality rate in the region. So you could say that he has no legitimacy at all, except for the fact that he's got the most powerful constituency of all, which is he's got, a constituency of one, the supreme leader, full endorsement, and who apparently sees this as the end of the battle between mosque and state, that he's asserted his full power. So then, finally, we always thought that maybe there was like a little bit, Rouhani could maybe even Ahmadinejad could maybe, stand up a little bit to the clerics, but who knows? So is that good news or bad news that it's the end of this division here? From a legitimacy point of view, probably not. From a ability to cut a deal, is this a Nixon in China moment? Probably not. Is this a Nixon, it was an Agnew in China moment? I don't think this guy's got a lot of power here. I think that they want some sort of a deal. They certainly want to get out of the sanctions. But they're asking, Biden thought they were going to get a deal before this guy came in, and that didn't happen. There's a certain Lucy in the football thing. I'm mixing my many metaphors here. The US wants more than Obama got. They want longer, stronger. They don't just want a nuclear deal. They want the Iranians to constrain their drone program, their cyber, their missile program, their support for terrorists. They're asking for an enormous amount. They're offering a considerable amount. No sign to my mind that they're going to get all that, and the Iranians are asking for one thing that I don't think is unreasonable, which is some sort of guarantee that the US won't pull out again, but there's no way in the world that a democracy can guarantee that. So I am extremely pessimistic. That said, to go back to where I started, this guy, even with his constituency of one, is up against a very neuralgic population, which is really struggling economically. So he's under a certain amount of pressure to try to cut a deal, but I don't think it's going to be the deal that Blinken thinks he can get. So the question becomes, given the fact that the Iranians are just months away from a breakout potential, having enough nuclear fuel for a weapon, where's the compromise going to come? So we'll see. I'm skeptical there'll be a deal, but I think there's considerable pressure on both sides to move forward.
Aaron, how do you see it, and what do you hear when you talk to your sources in Washington about whether they think this guy will be able to strike a deal, and a deal that the U.S. can sell?
Sell to whom?
Well, sell at home. Actually, that was for Karen.
I'm sorry.
Karen, what do you hear in Washington about the mood? I mean, it was pretty optimistic 6 months ago, but it doesn't seem to be.
It was
right
now. Selling it at home basically means selling it to Congress, and selling it to Congress depends on whether those people who don't want a deal can get enough support that allows them to somehow have some kind of veto power over it, or whether the administration is able to sidestep it in a way that Obama did when they first signed the deal. I think that U.S. officials, and certainly the E3, the Britain, France, and Germany, our main allies in this talk, everybody's sort of holding their breath right now. They did 6 rounds of talks, and they actually did pretty good, according to them. They agreed on which sanctions the United States would lift. They agreed on what the sort of basic parameters on how Iran would pull back from the advances that it's made beyond the terms of the original nuclear deal. And they thought that they could get a 7th round before the Iranian elections. Didn't happen. The Iranians, then they thought there would be this interregnum between the elections when Rouhani stepped down and Raisi became president. The Iranians informed them right after the elections that wasn't going to happen. So now they've got Raisi saying, we want a deal. We want to go back to the table. We don't know in what form. We don't know who is going to be the Iranian negotiators. We don't know if they're going to come back and say, great, we're glad you made all this progress. Now let's move on to what essentially are political decisions on both sides, and the kind of the kind of demands that Carla was talking about, which really are political decisions and not technical decisions. The technical stuff they've pretty much got sorted out. And so everybody certainly here, they're kind of holding their breath, waiting for the Iranians to say, okay, we're ready to come back. These are our negotiators. And when those negotiators, which they think will happen, but when those negotiators get there, if they say, are we back to square one, or do we accept what the previous team on our side did before, or do we want more? Where do we stand on all that? And they just don't know what's gonna happen. The Americans and the Europeans have made a point of saying, well, this can't go on forever. You guys are doing all this stuff that you're not supposed to do, and it becomes increasingly hard to pretend like all that didn't happen and to go back to where you're supposed to be under the agreement. So at some point, we're just going to have to say it's impossible to reconstitute the original deal, and it's just not going to happen. They don't have a plan B after that, sort of then what happens? I don't think anybody knows.
Ryan, are you hearing people talking about a plan B? I saw in the Wall Street Journal, I guess yesterday it was, Mark Rule-Gerecht and Ray Taki basically throwing up their hands and saying, war doesn't work, negotiations doesn't work. Let's just accept that Iran's going to be a nuclear weapon state and put real pressure on Iran on human rights and try to get regime change in a different way. No, Ray and Mark have never been particularly happy with the previous agreement, so not surprising. But I was a little surprised to see two really smart analysts to say, a nuclear Iran, we can figure out a way to live with it. Is that where we're ending up?
I wouldn't want to limit free expression, but I don't see how politically or morally that would be an acceptable position. But I honestly think of the Iran deal as the American version of Brexit, in the sense that it's endlessly circular. And so I deliberately try and keep my questioning and my knowledge to sort of like a high level politics level rather than the technical details. I'm like, show me the deal and then I'll care about it. What I suspect is we're not going to be seeing a deal. The Europeans endlessly talk it up. They're the constant positive spinners about it. And it's a regular pattern that, oh, we're about to get one, and then it never happens. And the people I've spoken to at the State Department and the NSC, they're just simply a lot more skeptical that this will happen than you see in a lot of the public level discussions. And given the deeper domestic political background in Congress, I just don't see how it's going to happen. But the alternative of allowing Iran to have a nuclear bomb is even worse. And so that also can't happen.
So, I mean, Karen and I have been obsessing over the exact things that you don't want to think about, Ryan, for a really long time. But, this is an unstable situation here. I mean, it's an unstable situation because you have things like, the Iranians, proxy groups killing American soldiers, and you have things like, these tankers getting droned and things almost hijacked. So you've got the instability on other fronts. And then you've got the Iranians moving forward. They're blind to the IAEA. They've shut off the cameras, so we don't know what's going on there. They've done a small amount of enrichment up to 60%, which is damn close to nuclear, to weapons grade. And they're beginning to bend metal, which is the next phase on moving toward a weapon. They say it's for medical uses, but they're inching closer and closer, much closer than they were before this deal. That's Trump's legacy here. So it's not a stable situation. So while I don't think there's going to be a deal and there is no acceptable plan B, it's pretty scary on multi fronts.
I think just to go back to something that Carla said earlier, with the technical people have worked all this stuff out there. Both sides now have political demands that are pretty much unmeetable by the other side. On the Iranian side, as Carla said, it's we want to guarantee that the next president, like Trump, isn't going to say we're out of here. Who can do that? No. The Biden wants, in order to make it more sellable to Congress, wants within the nuclear deal a commitment that once it's re-entered by everybody involved, that Iran agrees to move on to these follow-on talks about other things, ballistic missiles, drones, proxy wars that we don't like that the Iranians are doing. Both of those are pretty impossible things. In the U.S. case, I think completely impossible. And so the question is, how much can they find a way to work around that and to do some weasel wording that allows them on both sides to sell it. And I don't think they've gotten anywhere near that point. The important thing from the Iranian side, I think, though, is that they really want the sanctions lifted, and they really need the sanctions lifted. And so that is the imperative. Raisi says, the Supreme Leader says, yes, we're ready to go back into the negotiations. So we'll just see what that means. And I think it'll happen very quickly in the next couple of months, one way or the other.
I like Ryan's Brexit analogy of this thing just going on and on and on. And
that's exactly how I felt about Brexit. I did not understand it. I didn't feel I needed to understand it. I just had to wait till it was over and see what happened.
Understand it. That's
okay. But it's this, and I think, Karen, you really put your finger on it. It's not a technical issue anymore. It's now a political issue.
Right.
And the question is, what can both sides swallow politically in order to get to this deal? And and in that sense, that was exactly the same in Brexit. It was, what were you willing to swallow on the political side in order to get to the deal, and it just took a long time to get there.
Well, and what they can swallow depends on what they can sell.
Yes,
to their own constituencies.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I mean, if you are in Iran, demanding that the U.S. sticks to a deal you agree with is not unreasonable, given where they've been, even though it's impossible. And the same is true for the United States, to say we need to think, as Lincoln puts it, longer, stronger, broader in terms of the negotiation. But you're negotiating from a country that already walked away from one deal. So why would they even do the second deal? That's the underlying dynamic. The hope is that there's sufficient political will among the political sides that not going down the alternatives path, which really is nukes or war, which is how Obama, I think, put it originally, may in the end bring people together. But it's a tough nut to crack. And speaking, Karen, of tough nuts to crack, Cuba. We've been at this for, 60 some years now. We've gotten in a variety of different policies. I think there was a lot of expectation on the part of certain people in Cuba and the United States with the return of Biden, there would be a return to a policy of opening with the Cuban government by the Biden administration. Hasn't happened yet. And in the meantime, probably the most serious protests we've seen in Cuba in a very long time occurred a few weeks ago. How should we read the situation both inside Cuba, which you follow so closely, and also the response that is coming from the United States?
Well, I think I'm going to draw a comparison between Iran and Cuba, which may be stretching it a little bit. Iran's obviously a big, powerful country relative to Cuba, and it has oil, very important, that Cuba doesn't have. However, I think there are sort of some similarities now. They're both countries under extreme autocratic, communist or Islamic, whatever, control. They're both countries that are under extreme economic pressure from the United States. And they're both countries where people are saying, we've had it. We've had it with not enough food. We've had it with, electricity blackouts. We've had it with not being able to go anywhere or talk to anybody else. So, I think there are these similarities. In Cuba, as the Biden administration tries to come up with some sort of policy, in a way, it's sort of hoisted on its own petard. Biden campaigned for what he called a return to Obama policies, all of which had been pretty much thrown out by Trump. Reestablishment of relations. Trump closed it down for lots of reasons, but he found reasons to do what he wanted to do anyway. Shutdown of remittances, shutdown of trade, shutdown of travel. And so Biden came in with the expectation, certainly by Cuba, that this stuff was going to be reversed. He found a little bit of trouble doing that. For one thing, there was a lot of other stuff going on, and they just didn't get around to paying much attention to Cuba. There was opposition by some really powerful people in Congress that Biden needed to promote other aspects of his agenda. Most prominently, the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who are both Cuban Americans, who really are opposed to any return to an opening with Cuba. There was his own commitment to human rights that kind of clashed a little bit with what he wanted to do with Cuba. So they just sort of didn't do anything about it for a while. And then all of a sudden, the Cuban government didn't do itself any favors. As has happened in Iran, the Cuban people finally said, that's it, we've had it. I think the demonstrations started largely for economic reasons, electricity going out, no food in the shops, no hard currency to import any food. I mean, it's something like 80 or 90% of all Cuba's food is imported because they've had a horrible agricultural policy under a half century of state control. They cracked down. The Cuban government cracked down on the demonstrations, which sort of evolved from we want food to we want freedom. And it was the freedom part that people in this country grabbed onto. Certainly the Cuban American community, which the Democrats are very concerned about, having lost it as Trump won Florida in the last election, with midterms coming up. So I think that the administration then said, okay, we're going to have to put a hold on all these things to reach out to Cuba. We're going to have to adopt a tough line, mostly because we have a domestic agenda, a political agenda, and an agenda with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and its chairman, Bob Menendez, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, and of course, Marco Rubio, who is the ranking Republican on the committee, from Florida. So Biden, statements full of demands were issued, more sanctions were imposed. Last week, Biden laid out this 4-part plan. He would gather international support to condemn the Cuban regime, demand the release of some 700 people that supposedly were arrested in the demonstrations, which were of an unprecedented scope in Cuba. There have always been little political demonstrations in Cuba, but this was kind of all over, thousands of people in the streets, a lot of people arrested. Biden established a task force to study how best to resume remittances, payments mostly by Cuban Americans to family in Cuba, to avoid that the government getting a cut of it. How could they manage that? They would get the best IT minds to figure out how to assure reliable internet in Cuba, which the government's been cutting on and off, and which was crucial to organizing these demonstrations. And they would study how to safely reopen the consulate to allow Cubans to apply for visas. But the international solidarity part of it turned out to be kind of a bust. There's little love in Europe and Latin America for the communists in Cuba, but there's also real strong and long opposition to the US embargo and historical attempts to bring down the Cuban government with assassination plots against the Castros, covert actions. So things are sort of at a standstill right now. I mean, I think eventually they'll find a way to restore remittances, reopen the consulate. They'll probably find a way to provide internet services. I think for the Democrats, the real prize will still be the 2022 midterm elections, and see how they do in Florida. Extremely doubtful, as Carla, who's spent a lot of time in Cuba, knows, that the Cuban government will cave on any of this anytime soon. So what happens there is up to the Cuban people, how much they can push. The organized political opposition there is very small, a lot of little grupitos that many don't like each other. They don't even talk to each other. And the question is whether those people who have never been part of the organized opposition in Cuba, or at least were not willing to do something about it that was going to get them in trouble, the young people, the cultural community, artists, they're the ones who called people out in the streets, whether they continue to say enough and bring people out into the streets.
Thanks, Karen. That's just a great overview of where we are and of the dilemmas. And Carla, it reminds me that the first thing to do when you're in the hole is to stop digging. 63 years of an embargo and sanctions, and change hasn't come.
Carla long ago wrote a fabulous book about Cuba.
And we'll make sure that people know know about that. No, I mean you again,
Ivo is my doctoral thesis, which I published.
Oh yeah, okay, excellent. It's very important.
A running joke between Ivo and me. Yes.
Yeah. Well, given that you have not only a doctorate but published your thesis, how can we continue to think that a policy that has so utterly failed is the right policy to continue to pursue?
How many electoral votes do they have in Florida? That's the beginning and the end of that question. There was a time, and it was really extraordinary when Obama pulled this off, that he said there was a next generation of Cuban Americans who didn't, who saw the future, and that we could throw off the chains of domestic politics and get it. It didn't work. Let's move on, which is what Obama said. And then this election came along, and so Biden is trapped by domestic politics. And I don't think, and Karen would know this infinitely better than I would, and Ryan probably too, because I haven't been following it as much. But I don't think Biden's very invested in Cuba policy the way Obama was.
Yeah,
this was right. Obama's thing. This was Obama's last, this was his moonshot in the last few things. He totally got it. He really cared about it. Sent Ben Rhodes, this was the whole thing for him. I don't think he's invested in it. What I would say about this, the thing that fascinated me is, A, Castro's gone, which is very different. Diaz-Canel is not a Castro. That's the first thing. And B, if you got a minute, go on YouTube and watch and listen to Patria Vida, which was the song everybody was singing that was recorded both in Miami and in Cuba. Usually Miami's, Cuban Miami's, and these people they're dark skinned. It's a beautiful song. B, you should, if you don't speak Spanish, you should listen to the translation. This is a new view of Cuba. You can say, fatherland and death. We say fatherland and life, or, country and life. It's a new view. Do I think things are in the same change in Cuba? It's a different Cuba from the Cuba I knew. So, they still own the guns, but I will say that song gave me a teeny bit of hope that there was a potential for change. Of course, I was there in '89 and people were telling me that things were going to change in '89 too. And that was a really long time ago.
On the politics, the last I looked, Joe Biden won the presidency without winning Florida. So it is possible to do this. But certainly on the House and the congressional side, it had a huge impact. Ryan, last word for you. I know you've been following the story closely as well. Do you think Patria Vida is going to be the revolutionary song that finally changes things, or that what's behind it in the way that Carla talked about? And Karen too, of course, the younger.
I think there are signs of hope there, but it doesn't feel like this is an organized opposition yet, and it's not being funded by outsiders, whether it's the United States or somebody else. So probably sorting out the internet issue is number one in helping move the protest movement along. But the regime is the one that holds most of the cards here. So I don't think that there's going to be a revolution anytime soon. But people are clearly getting fed up, and that matters. That's an essential ingredient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient for a revolution to occur. And this is a political gift to Joe Biden. Whether anyone wants sort of the light version of Marco Rubio from him or Florida Democrats, I don't know whether voters in Florida are going to be picking that up if Democrats are putting that down. But it's an opportunity for them to try. And that's more than what they had in 2020.
I'll go back to Karen, your starting point when we talked about this. There are countries that are in deep, deep, deep trouble because their people are saying, basta, fini, it's enough, and they're willing to stand up. And when that happens, it's very hard to stop it, no matter how bad the repression can be. But people who need bread, people who need water, as Lenin used successfully in 1917, are people who you can mobilize with good leadership. So we'll see what happens in Cuba, in Iran, around the world with COVID. I want to thank Carla, Robbins, Karen DeYoung, Ryan, Heath for being with us for yet another edition of World Review. I want to wish all of you a happy weekend. Spend it in good ways, and we'll be back not next week or the week after. We'll be back at the end of August for another version of our World Review, our weekly news roundup here. Again, Carla, Karen, Ryan, thanks so much, and we'll see you the next time.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.